The first woman took one look at him and turned around and walked back inside the general store without saying a word. The second woman laughed. Not behind her hand, not quietly, not the kind of laugh a person tries to hold back. A full, open laugh that came out of her mouth like a bark and made three men on the porch turn their heads and grin because the joke was obvious. The joke was Silas Cobb standing in the middle of the street in Prescott, Arizona, in the spring of 1876, wearing a fur-lined hide coat that smelled like wood smoke and elk blood, with hair that hadn't been cut in 3 years hanging wild past his shoulders, and a beard that reached the middle of his chest, and a face behind it all that God had apparently assembled in the dark. He had a nose that had been broken 4 times, and had healed crooked each time in a different direction. He had a scar that ran from his left temple down across his jaw where a cougar had opened him up when he was 26, and a trapper named Finnegan had sewn it shut with fishing line and whiskey. His eyes were set deep under a heavy brow, and his left ear was mangled from frostbite, and his skin was so sun-darkened and wind-scored that he looked like something carved from old wood and left outside for a decade. He was 47 years old, and he had come down from the mountains for the first time in 14 months because he was lonely. He wouldn't have used that word. He would have said something practical, that a man needs help, that winter is hard alone, that he was looking for a wife because a wife is a useful thing to have on a homestead. But the truth underneath the practical words was simpler and sadder. He was lonely. He'd been lonely for 20 years, ever since his wife Mary had died giving birth to a baby that died with her, and he'd walked into the mountains with a rifle and an axe and a grief so heavy it bent his spine, and he'd stayed up there because the mountains didn't look at him the way people did. The mountains didn't flinch. The mountains didn't laugh. The mountains just stood there, enormous and silent and indifferent. And for a man like Silas, indifference was the closest thing to acceptance he'd ever found. But loneliness has a weight limit. Even for a man built like Silas, even for a man who could split a cord of wood in an afternoon and carry a deer carcass down a ridge on his back, there's a limit to how much silence a person can carry before it starts to crush them. He'd hit that limit sometime in February when a blizzard had locked him inside his cabin for 9 days, and he'd sat by the stove and listened to the wind and realized he hadn't heard another human voice in 4 months. And the realization sat on his chest like a stone and wouldn't move. So he'd come down. He'd come to town. He'd heard that the church in Prescott was organizing introductions for men seeking wives and women seeking husbands, a polite way of saying what everyone knew it was, which was a matching service for the desperate and the leftover, for the men too rough or too poor or too old, and the women too plain or too worn or too burdened to find a match on their own. Silas qualified on every count. He'd washed in the creek. He'd put on his cleanest shirt, which wasn't clean by any standard but was the least stained. He'd tied his hair back with a leather cord, which did nothing to improve his appearance but at least suggested he'd tried. And he'd walked into town and stood in the street and waited for someone to see him as something other than the thing that made children grab their mother's skirts and cross the road. The third woman didn't laugh. She looked at him with the careful expression of a person trying to be kind, while every part of her face was screaming no, and she said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Cobb, I don't think we'd be a good match." Which was the polite version of what her face was already saying, and Silas nodded and said, "I understand." Because he did understand. He'd understood since he was a boy that his face was a locked door, and no amount of knocking was going to open it. He turned to leave. He was done. 3 women, 3 rejections, and the third one was the worst, because it was kind, and kindness from someone who doesn't want you is sharper than cruelty from someone who doesn't see you. He was done with the introductions, and done with the town, and done with the entire idea that a man like him could walk down from the mountains and find someone willing to share a life with a face the world couldn't stand to look at. He'd go back up. He'd split wood and trap elk and sit by his stove in the silence, and he'd make peace with it the way he'd made peace with everything else, which was not really peace, but the absence of fighting. He was halfway to the edge of town when the boy appeared. He came out of nowhere the way children do, fast and sudden and without any of the caution that adults carry like armor. A boy, maybe 7 or 8, thin and brown-haired and barefoot in the dirt, wearing clothes that were 2 sizes too big, and had been washed so many times they'd gone the color of dust. He ran straight up to Silas and stopped and looked up at him, and Silas braced himself for the reaction, the flinch, the scream, the running back to Mama. But it didn't come. The boy just looked at him with wide, serious eyes and said, "Are you a bear?" Silas blinked. "What?" "My sister said you were a bear. I said bears don't wear boots. Are you a bear?" "No," Silas said. "I'm not a bear." "I told her." The boy turned around and yelled toward the general store. He's not a bear, Lily, I told you. Then he turned back to Silas and extended his hand, a small, dirty hand with bitten fingernails and a scrape across the knuckles, and said, I'm Henry. You want to come meet my mama? Before Silas could answer, a woman appeared in the doorway of the general store. She was thin. That was the first thing he noticed. Thin in the way that means not enough food for too long. Not the fashionable kind of thin, but the survival kind. She was maybe 30, with dark hair pinned up loosely under a bonnet that had seen better days, and she wore a faded brown dress with a patched apron, and she had the face of a woman who'd been tired for so long that tired had become her resting state. She was holding a girl of about 4 on her hip, the girl who'd apparently called him a bear, and another boy, older than Henry, maybe 9, stood behind her with his hand on the doorframe, watching Silas with an expression that was not afraid, but not trusting either. The expression of a child who'd already learned that men couldn't be counted on. Henry, get back here, the woman said. Her voice was firm but not harsh. The voice of a woman who spent most of her energy keeping small people alive and didn't have any left over for volume. Mama, he's not a bear. I checked. By the way, if this story is already pulling you in, take a moment to subscribe and leave a comment telling us what country you're listening from. We love knowing where our listeners are. Now let's continue. The woman looked at Silas. She didn't flinch. She didn't laugh. She didn't do any of the things the 3 women at the church introduction had done. She looked at him the way a person looks at a tree or a fence post or a storm cloud, assessing, practical, without judgment about whether the thing was beautiful or ugly, because beauty and ugliness are luxuries, and this woman clearly hadn't had a luxury in years. I'm sorry about Henry, she said. He talks to everyone. It's fine, Silas said. He didn't know what else to say. He wasn't used to talking to people, and he especially wasn't used to talking to women. And he stood there in the dirt with his massive scarred hands hanging at his sides like tools he'd forgotten how to use for anything except chopping and carrying. You're here for the introductions, she said. It wasn't a question. Was, he said, leaving now. Nobody took you. It wasn't cruel the way she said it. It was factual, the same way you'd say the sun is out or the well is dry. She was stating what was obvious, and she wasn't pretending it wasn't obvious, and Silas respected that because he'd had enough pretending for one day. Nobody took me, he confirmed. She shifted the girl on her hip. She looked at him for a long time. Long enough that Silas started to feel the old familiar urge to turn away, to hide, to put distance between his face and whoever was looking at it. But he didn't turn away because something in her expression held him. She wasn't looking at his face the way the other women had. She was looking at his hands, his arms, his shoulders. She was looking at the way he stood, which was solid and grounded, the stance of a man who could hold up a roof if it was falling. She was looking at him the way you look at a structure when you need to know if it's going to hold. My name is Adelaide Marsh, she said. My husband died 8 months ago, thrown from a wagon. I have 3 children, no money, and a lease on a piece of land I can't work alone. I came to the introductions too. Nobody wanted a woman with 3 mouths to feed. She paused. She looked at Henry, who was still standing next to Silas, and had now grabbed a handful of his hide coat and was examining the fur with intense concentration. She looked at the girl on her hip, who had her thumb in her mouth and was staring at Silas with the unblinking fascination of a 4-year-old who hadn't decided yet whether something was scary or interesting. She looked at the older boy in the doorway whose expression hadn't changed. My kids need a father, she said. Not a handsome one, not a rich one, a strong one who can work and provide and stay. Can you stay, Mr. Cobb? Silas looked at her. He looked at the boy holding his coat. He looked at the girl on her hip. He looked at the older boy in the doorway who was watching him like a judge weighing a verdict. And he felt something shift inside his chest. Not hope exactly, because hope had been beaten out of him so many times that he no longer trusted it, but something adjacent to hope. Something that felt like a door opening half an inch in a house where every door had been nailed shut for 20 years. I can stay, he said. They married that afternoon. The same reverend who'd organized the introductions performed the ceremony in the church with Henry fidgeting in the front pew and Lily asleep on a bench, and the older boy, Thomas, standing against the wall with his arms crossed, watching everything with those careful, measuring eyes. Adelaide wore her brown dress because it was her only dress. Silas wore his hide coat because it was his only coat. The reverend said the words, and Adelaide said, I do, and Silas said, I do, and when the reverend said they could kiss, Adelaide looked at Silas, and Silas looked at Adelaide, and she said, Not yet. Earn it. And something in her voice told him she meant it, and something in her face told him the earning would be worth it. They rode out to her land that evening. It was 12 miles south of town on a piece of flat ground between 2 ridges, with a creek running through it. The cabin was small and in bad shape. The roof leaked, the porch was rotting, one wall had a crack you could see daylight through. The barn was worse. The fence around the property was falling down in 3 places, and the vegetable patch was overgrown, and the whole place had the look of something that had been held together by one person's willpower, and that person's willpower had run out sometime around the 6th month of doing it alone. Silas stood in the yard and looked at all of it, the leaking roof and the rotting porch and the cracked wall and the broken fence, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt something that wasn't loneliness. He felt useful. He felt like every skill he'd built in 20 years of surviving alone in the mountains, building, fixing, chopping, carrying, making something hold together when the world was trying to pull it apart, had been training for this. He thought those skills were about keeping himself alive. Now he understood they were about keeping someone else alive, and the difference between those two things was the difference between surviving and living. He started the next morning before dawn. He fixed the porch first because it was dangerous and the children ran across it 20 times a day, and he wasn't going to let a child fall through rotting wood on his watch. He pulled every board and replaced them with fresh-cut planks, and he had it done by noon, and Henry sat on the new porch and bounced on it and said, "It doesn't wiggle anymore," with a voice so full of wonder that Silas had to turn away because his throat was doing something he didn't trust. He fixed the wall next, then the roof, then the fence. He worked 16 hours a day for the first week, and Adelaide watched him and fed him and didn't say much, and what she did say was practical. "There's water in the bucket, supper's at 6, the axe handle is cracked." She didn't thank him because thanking him would have turned his work into a favor, and it wasn't a favor. It was a marriage. It was a deal. She'd offered him a family and he'd offered her his hands, and the transaction didn't require gratitude, it required results. The children adjusted at different speeds. Henry adjusted immediately because Henry adjusted to everything immediately. He followed Silas like a shadow from the first day, handing him nails, carrying boards that were too heavy for him, asking questions at a rate that should have been exhausting but wasn't, because Silas had been so hungry for conversation that even a 7-year-old's endless stream of why and how and what if felt like rain after a drought. Lily adjusted in the 2nd week. She stopped calling him a bear and started calling him nothing at all, which was followed by a period of standing near him and watching him work, which was followed by the afternoon she fell asleep on his lap while he was sitting on the porch, and he didn't move for 2 hours because she was warm and small, and her breathing was steady, and he would have sat there until his legs went numb before he'd wake her. Thomas didn't adjust. Thomas was 9, and Thomas remembered his father, and Thomas wasn't going to replace his father with a wild-looking stranger, no matter how many fences the stranger fixed. He was polite because his mother required it. He said yes, sir, and no, sir, and please and thank you, and none of it reached his eyes. Silas didn't push. He recognized in Thomas the same guardedness he carried in himself. The refusal to let someone in because letting someone in means giving them the power to leave, and leaving is what people do. Thomas would come around or he wouldn't, and Silas wasn't going to force it because forced trust isn't trust, it's obedience. And obedience breaks the first time it's tested. The thing that changed Thomas happened in the 6th week. A storm came through, not a blizzard, but a hard, fast rain with wind that bent the cottonwoods sideways and turned the creek into a brown, churning mess. The new fence held. The new roof held. The new porch held. Everything Silas had built held because Silas built things the way the mountains had taught him. To last, to endure, to stand up when the world was pushing hard against them. But the barn didn't hold because Silas hadn't gotten to the barn yet, and the old beam that held up the loft cracked in the wind, and the loft floor dropped 6 inches. And the sound it made was loud enough to be heard inside the cabin. And Thomas who didn't trust Silas, Thomas who wouldn't look at him, Thomas who kept his distance and his silence like armor. Thomas ran to the barn because the barn was where the chickens were, and the chickens were his responsibility, the one job his father had given him before he died. And a 9-year-old boy's loyalty to a dead father's last instruction is stronger than any storm. Silas saw him run. He went after him. He got to the barn and found Thomas standing under the broken loft trying to shoo the chickens out, while the beam above him groaned and split further, and the whole structure was minutes from coming down. Silas didn't yell. He didn't grab. He walked in, and he put himself between Thomas and the beam, and he braced the beam with his shoulders and his hands, and he held it, held the entire weight of a collapsing loft on his back. And he said calmly and quietly, "Thomas, take the chickens and walk out. Don't run. Walk." Thomas looked up at him. He looked at the beam on Silas's shoulders. He looked at Silas's face, which was red and straining and ugly and absolutely certain, the face of a man who would stand there until his spine cracked before he'd let that beam fall on a child. And something in Thomas's expression broke open. Not all at once, not dramatically, just a crack, like ice in spring, small but irreversible. He gathered the chickens. He walked out. Silas held the beam until the boy was clear, and then he dove sideways, and the loft came down in a crash of wood and dust. And Silas lay on the barn floor with splinters in his hair and a gash on his forearm, and he looked at the doorway where Thomas was standing with a chicken under each arm, and Thomas said, "Are you okay?" And his voice was different. His voice was the voice of a boy who'd just watched a man risk his life for him and was recalculating everything he thought he knew. That night, Thomas sat next to Silas at the table instead of across from him. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. He just sat there, close enough that their elbows touched, and when Adelaide saw it, she turned to the stove and pressed her hand over her mouth, and Silas saw her shoulders shake once, and then she was still. Adelaide kissed him for the first time on a Sunday morning 3 months after the wedding. He was sitting on the porch he'd built, drinking coffee, watching the sun come up over the ridge, and she came out and stood beside him and looked at the land, the fixed fence, the new barn he'd started, the garden she'd replanted, the children's clothes drying on the line, and she said, "You earned it." She leaned down and kissed him, not on the cheek, on the mouth, slowly, deliberately, the way a woman kisses a man she's chosen not because he's beautiful, but because he's real. And Silas sat very still with his coffee in his hand, and his eyes closed and tears running down into his beard, and he didn't wipe them because wiping them would have required letting go of this moment, and he wasn't ready to let go of anything ever again. 2 years later, the property didn't look the same. The cabin had 2 new rooms. The barn was solid and full. The fence ran straight and strong around 20 acres. There were cattle now, a small herd, and the vegetable garden fed them through winter with enough left over to sell. Henry was 9 and followed Silas everywhere and was learning to build. Lily was 6 and sat on Silas's lap every evening and called him Papa, and he let her because the word in her mouth was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. Thomas was 11 and working beside Silas like a partner, not a child. And one afternoon he looked at Silas and said, "My father would have liked you." And Silas set down the hammer he was holding and put his hand on the boy's shoulder and couldn't speak. Adelaide stood on the porch and watched her family in the yard. The wild man from the mountains who'd come down looking for someone who could stand his face, and found instead 3 children who never cared about his face, and a woman who'd looked past it on a dirt street in 5 seconds flat. And she put her hand on her belly because there was a new life growing in there, the first one that would be theirs together, and she smiled. Not the tired smile she'd worn for 2 years after her husband died. A real smile, the kind that starts deep and reaches the surface slowly, the kind you earn by surviving the worst thing and finding on the other side not what you expected but something better. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you that the right person doesn't come in the package you imagined, they come in the one you need, then subscribe and join us for the next one. Leave a comment and tell us where you're listening from. And remember, beauty is not a face. It's what a man does when a beam is falling and a child is underneath.